if you do want to give us some updated information.
When I listen to the radio, I'm probably on the bus or walking.
Dan Borscher and Adam Shirley on ABC Radio Canberra.
It might be a scan for your heart, perhaps an initial diagnosis of the dreaded C, cancer, which you need to get scanned for to confirm the extent or the severity of. But it'll be even worse news to you if that's what news has come to you, that services at the Canberra Hospital are being affected by a mechanical problem with Australia's nuclear reactor. The lack of supply for isotopes used in medical imaging for things like heart problems, lung conditions and cancer are being affected, including right here in the ACT. How serious is this problem? And importantly, how can it be fixed? Geoff Currie is a nuclear medicine expert from Charles Sturt University based in Wagga, and he's with us now. Geoff Currie, I know this is your stock in trade, but we should come back to the basics. Nuclear isotopes, why are they important in medicine?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's nuclear isotopes are really important in medicine because they actually deal with the pathologies and the problems that many of the other imaging modalities or pathology tests or other investigations can't. So we often have patients that are confounded or have confounded other imaging or pathology tests. And so it's to provide, that sharp end to be able to look at more than just anatomy, but the physiology and the molecular level function to trace those intricate biological pathways so that we actually get an insight into not only what disease is there, but how it might be best treated.
I mentioned some of the serious conditions that nuclear medicine might be used to diagnose. How extensively are nuclear isotopes used in these cases?
Yeah, it's as widespread. Every organ system in the body is imaged with nuclear medicine. Some of them are done in an acute setting or urgent settings, things like pulmonary embolism in the lung. Others actually change significantly the patient management. So a breast cancer patient may actually have a nuclear medicine scan immediately before surgery to help identify sentinel nodes in the lymphatics. And then some of them are more elective, but we're imaging everything from the tear ducts in the eyes to the heart, the brain, the lungs, the bones, the GI tract, liver, kidneys, you name it, we image it.
So patients in the ACT and surrounding region will be asking this morning, how are these shortages and these problems going to affect my services, the imaging I need to get done at the hospital?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty dire situation across the country with the fault that has occurred. It's not actually a fault in the reactor, it's actually a fault in the facility that extracts the actual medical isotope from what's produced in the reactor. And because of the position where the fault occurred, it's actually more dire than it has been previously if there was a breakdown in the generator processing plant, for example. So it's actually bad from that perspective that we can't get anything out, and at the same time not be able to import things from South Africa, which is usually our backup, because they've been having some maintenance on their reactor over there. So across the country, as we're looking about for next week, about 31% of our normal yield, and the amount of activity that would be available is reduced to about 31%. Now, of course, we use that in any given week. We're typically a little bit less efficient than we could be when you've got a surplus. And so realistically, we might be functioning at about half of our normal capacity. And that impacts the whole country, but in different ways depending on where you're at. So it's actually quite dire.
So what impacts here in the ACT do you anticipate?
So you might be looking at, in terms of the available isotope coming into the ACT, is that some of the private clinics won't get any activity at all. That's occurring across the country, but in Canberra, some of the private clinics won't get any activity at all. And then some of the larger clinics like the Canberra Hospital and John James Hospital will actually be on limited supply of urgent doses coming out of a centralised pharmacy run by Global Medical Solutions.
It's 21 minutes to 9. You're on Breakfast. You're hearing from Geoff Currie, the nuclear medicine expert from Charles Sturt University in Wagga. We're hearing that the Canberra Health Services says it's negotiating with ANSTO to prioritise that ongoing supply to the Canberra Hospital, but presumably all health services are in the same boat. So how will need be decided upon?
Yeah, so you're right. There's 250 nuclear medicine sites across the country that are all negotiating with ANSTO to have priority service. So you can't actually give priority service based on, relationships over the phone. what you've got to do is you've got to step back and actually try to, number one, service the biggest number of Australians, in the country. And how do you do that? By targeting the largest populations, but also those services that provide critical care services. So, if you tripped over and you're wondering about a fracture, or you've got a stress fracture, and all those things that are really important if you're the patient, but are not going to actually cause any life-changing, incidents, well, then that's not really what we'd call a high priority. But if you look at somewhere like Canberra Hospital or John James Hospital, where they're actually dealing with, critical patients and after-hours emergency care, then you need to be able to provide priority activity to those sites. But we've got over 100 of those across the country. So every capital city, a lot of our regional towns are here in Wagga. We actually have a couple of departments, but one of them services a major private hospital and inpatients and critical care patients. So you've got to try to prioritise the distribution of those, the available activity to those sites that provide the urgent patients. But then those sites then need to prioritise the limited activity that they've got to be able to service those critical patients as opposed to the elective outpatients.
So essentially a triaging sort of a system. We've heard from Canberra Health Services. They say that the supply from ANSTO will allow urgent nuclear medicine scans to be offered up to next Friday, the 20th of September, and their health service is hopeful that the situation will be resolved before then. How realistic is that thinking?
Yeah, look, I was in a meeting yesterday, and I think it's unrealistic that it'll be a 1 week delay. I think that realistically we're looking at a minimum of 2 or 3 week, decrease in production. My feeling is that next week is not going to be the worst week. It'll be the week after that is actually the most dire of weeks.
And why is that?
Because this week we've been able to salvage activity that it was actually in the system before the breakdown. And so it means that we've actually got that profile of 31% of our usual activity coming from the actual ANSTO reactor. Next week, we don't have anything coming out of the ANSTO reactor in terms of being able to be delivered. So we're entirely reliant on what can be delivered from South Africa. And because they've been down, is that the estimate there that has been released to the nuclear medicine community is about 27% of supply. So the week after next, we're looking at actually operating across the country on about 27% of the usual activity profile that we'd get from ANSTO.
And so what does that mean then? Does that just essentially see that there will be a tightening in the triage process, that it will only be very specific types of perhaps cancer treatments that get access rather than the broken bones and the like?
Yeah, exactly. Is that there has to be a meeting once that they actually know how much activity is coming and actually work out what the best way to distribute that is. Of course, there's no way to distribute that makes anyone happy, let alone everyone happy, because you either get nothing or you get so little that you can not operate, your practice, and so everyone is unhappy. And so we just need to bide our time and actually try to get through that process and rely on ANSTO to be able to. They've identified the problem. They haven't been able to start the fix on that process. The estimates of that would be, sometime next week they might have some more information about how they can progress that fix, and hopefully it ends up being a 3 week delay or 3 week turn down, and then we're back to normal production. But at this stage, we don't know.
And it begs a couple of questions to conclude with, Mr. Currie. Are there any other sources of these radioactive isotopes that Australia and the ACT can source that aren't currently being tapped?
The answer to that is no, is that, ANSTO is connected all around the world, and they've been working endlessly trying to tap into any available molybdenum to bring it in and make it available in Australia. But there is a global glut in it. One of the other initiatives that's being pushed forward that the Rural Alliance in Nuclear Scintigraphy has worked with a couple of people, including a couple of big private organisations, and communicated with the Minister as well as the Chief Medical Officer to try to push forward the idea of substitution, where you could have a like-for-like substitution. And this would advantage Canberra, because you've got 2 PET scanners in Canberra that for something like a bone scan, which are used for patients with metastatic spread of cancer to the bone and those sorts of things, that you can actually do a bone scan on PET. But the problem is that that's not covered by the Medicare rebate, and so we're making an argument that perhaps you could actually substitute those like for like and make it available to those patients.
Which goes to my next query. PET scans are an alternative. Is it a matter of trying to make them available on Medicare plans or some sort of subsidised plan so that shortfall can be made up?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the solutions. It's not going to actually solve all the problems. Not everyone has PET, and those PET cameras that are around actually have a very high load associated with patients that have their other oncology studies typically going through. So they're actually, it's not like there's all of a sudden this big window to be scanning thousands of patients on PET.
Okay.
But for those urgent patients, is the option of actually using a fluorine-18 whole body bone scan. It's actually there. There's companies that are available that can produce the fluorine-18 ion here in Australia and distribute it nationally. And what that would then do is that it would be a situation where that if you have a PET scanner and can produce those kinds of bone scans, well then it means that your demand for the technetium is not as high, and that could be made more available for the departments that don't have access to PET. And free up that load that way. So that's something that I know that the Chief Medical Officer and the Minister have actually looked at, and we've made an appeal to Medicare to try to do that urgently.
We'll see if that can be put in place in the next couple of days. In the meantime, it sounds like, in all seriousness, we'll be needing to cross some fingers and toes here, Geoff Currie.
Yeah, I think that I think we're all got to be fairly patient and realistic, and that people, when it's your own health, you're not usually very patient. So I think you need to sort of step back and realise that if you're missing out or you're being rescheduled, then that means that there's people ahead of you that are much higher priority. It's more dire for them to have their scan than you, as much as we prefer to actually have priority for ourselves. And the same goes for the departments. We scale it up to the departments, and the departments that are missing out on activity next week, and there's a large number of them across the country, that they're not going to be happy about that, but they need to realise that activity has been prioritised to departments that actually provide more critical care to patients.
Tell you what, it's sobering stuff, and thank you for putting, I guess, the information behind the story for us today, Geoff Currie. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Geoff Currie, nuclear medicine expert based at Charles Sturt University in Wagga. He's been in the room with some of these discussions, damn critical discussions, about how to get really important health scans done when the radioisotopes simply are not available. And these next few weeks might be really tough for people who've got serious health problems.
Well, yeah, and Adam, the point he was making there, that it won't be this first week that could be the most dire, it'll be after that, where I think he pointed to the number of 27% is the volume that will be there. This text that comes in.
If you do want to give us some updates